All right, let's talk about the lead up to the War of 1812. Even though Madison wins the election of 1808, Madison was the same party as Jefferson, but he manages to win the presidential election. But the Federalists, who had been down and out for a while, suddenly find themselves on the upsurge a little bit because the Embargo Act was such an unpopular act. Madison comes into office. He wants to remain neutral. Nobody thought war was a good idea, except probably the members of Federalists who were going to push war. And there's a group of people out there that are called war hawks that really are going to push for war. Even inside of Madison's own party, they're going to want war, and he's not so sure that's the best idea. We, when we look at causes of the war, there are some doozies that we have to kind of get through, and we kind of believe that in addition to the British seizing our cargoes and seizing our soldiers or our sailors and kidnapping them off our ships abroad, that they were aggravating the Indians out on the frontier. It had led to several conflicts between the settlers and the Native Americans out on the frontier, including in places like Indiana and others. So we had a bone to pick with the English, and not everybody's really happy about that. Even inside of Madison's own party, there is a real push for war over some of these issues. Okay? So don't think that we went into the War of 1812, though, really with all of us on the same page, because it's not true. Madison is confronted with a lot of problems. I'm going to switch over here for a second and kind of show you what we're talking about here. The When we look at causes, there are all of these causes that are tied to the War of 1812. One is this impressment, that the British were seizing our ships, seizing our sailors, kidnapping our sailors, and that's not going to sit very well. And it really is an act of war in the get go. Told you guys that the during Jefferson's administration, there had been an attack on an American ship. The British ship Leopard here will fire on the American ship Chesapeake in June of 1807. Jefferson had really been angry about this, led to 3 Americans being killed, 18 wounded. All right, and it led to the Embargo Act, which was not very popular. Excuse me. The election of 1808, I told you guys that Madison had won, okay, won most of the South, but the Federalists still had some sway up in, especially in New England. So when Madison became president, he has to deal with all of this. Okay? And by the way, that's his wife, Dolly Madison, and Dolly is usually considered to be one of the best first ladies, and really is a model for all the first ladies. Madison was kind of bookish. He didn't really he didn't like socializing. He didn't like parties. Dolly was the life of the party, and so she was very good at dealing with ambassadors or congressmen or senators who'd come to the White House. She was really the social butterfly, and Madison would much rather be in a corner somewhere reading a book. The lead up to the war is that I told you guys about this just a minute ago about the British instigation of the Indians. That in 1811, William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, had been trying to get Native Americans to sign away land to the U.S. government. An Indian confederation under the leadership of Tecumseh, who is pictured right here, and who is really the head of a confederation of Indians who are going to try to fight the Americans, will go to war against Indiana. Tecumseh's brother, who's known as the Prophet, will fight against Harrison, William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory. He's defeated at the famous Battle of Tippecanoe, and it made Harrison a national hero, and it'll later propel him into the presidency in 1840. These congressional war hawks, though, like Henry Clay from Kentucky or John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who are going to dominate American politics over the next really 20, 30 years, are really pushing Madison towards war. Madison wins the election of 1812. He gets a second term, but we are headed towards war. And when the British continue to steal our sailors, Madison really has no choice except to declare war. Biggest problem, though, we are totally unprepared. Financially, militarily, we are terribly unprepared. The Jefferson had cut budgets. Our military was way weaker than any of us would have liked. We don't have any navy basically against the British, so we don't really have a good standing army. So we're in trouble. We are in trouble financially. We are in trouble militarily. Basically, we try strategy in the beginning of trying to attack Canada and keep the British occupied up here in Canada. It's not going to go very well. We are woefully unprepared. We do very poorly. Now, later in the war, we will do pretty well on the Great Lakes here. But if you notice, we are blockaded here. The British Navy blockades us here. And most of the fighting is up here in the beginning. Then the British decide to attack our nation's capital, which they will do very effectively, burning the White House and burning the nation's capital as they invade here. And that's not good. When you get your country your country's capital invaded in 1814, the situation is not very good. The British will attack the shore batteries in Maryland, trying to get to the nation's capital. Francis Scott Key observes one of the bombardments of Fort McHenry in 1814 and pens the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. So if you've ever wondered what the inspiration for that was, then you can go and read about the bombardment of Fort McHenry. New Englanders considered leaving the Union. They were so unhappy about the war. They were so unhappy about Madison's really work on the war that they almost left the Union. They were prepared to really make a statement. Some of the New England states were prepared to make a statement about possibly leaving the Union when all of a sudden in December of 1814 the war ended. British and American negotiators sit down and negotiate a peace, and the war ends. The war is over, and nothing happens. There is no real territorial change. Essentially, the war is the Latin phrase is status quo ante bellum. We go back to the way things were before the war, and the war ends. It undermines the New Englanders who were really preparing, perhaps, to threaten to leave the Union. And then nobody bothered to tell the British who were planning to invade New Orleans. And so the Battle of New Orleans takes place in early 1815 after the war was over. Nobody bothered to tell these guys. Communications in the early 1800s not what they are today. Today we would say they didn't get the email, but these guys don't know that the war is over. So the entire battle for New Orleans in 1815 was really fought after the war was over. The leader of the American forces in New Orleans is this guy, Andrew Jackson, who had raised a company of volunteers, had really marched them through Alabama and down into New Orleans to defend the city and try to keep the British from taking control of New Orleans. The British forces foolhardily attacked Jackson's emplaced positions. The Jackson had taken up a position behind really a canal, and then he had really used cotton bales and other things to form a almost an impenetrable barrier here. And the British attack stupidly and are crushed at the Battle of New Orleans. So it makes Jackson a national hero. And when we kind of think about that, we'll talk about Jackson's presidency later on, and this really catapults him into the presidency. The So when we kind of think about the War of 1812, remember that we were woefully underprepared. Most of the fighting takes place in the beginning up here in Canada until the British attack us in Washington, D.C. in August of 1814, and then attack New Orleans in January of 1815, unfortunately, after the war was over. The When we kind of get through this, okay, and we talk about the War of 1812, the kind of the thing to remember is that the war ends essentially with not a whole lot changing, and Madison's presidency is dominated by the build up to the War of 1812. All right, we'll stop there, and when we come back and talk about the next thing, we'll be talking about the really the what happens next, which is really a very patriotic time in American history. And we'll talk about that next time.